brothers WISP. The brothers WISP, brothers WISP. The brothers WISP. The brothers.
You're now listening to Greg. It's the brothers WISP. Let's take
Hey everybody, this is Greg with the brothers WISP number 123. 123 of these jokers, and tonight we have a packed house. We are all socially distanced. I mean, we are all across the United States, save for 3 of these ding-dongs. They're all up in Illinois for some reason. So hopefully they're wearing their masks, staying at least 6 feet apart. Let's go through the roster. So tonight we have, let's see, am I pointing the right direction? No, I'm pointing that direction. I always get my overlays backwards. Over there we have Nick Arellano from Illinois.
Yep. Hi, everybody.
So that's Nick A. Then we also have Nick Braulio, Nick B. from Illinois. Just in case you guys don't know enough Nick, we brought 2 of them. We also have Mikey. Oh, that direction. I got to figure this out. Mikey from Chicagoland.
Hey.
Also,
I just checked Google Maps and I could leave my house and be to both of the Nick's house in under 3 hours.
Just keep your sanitizer handy just in case. And then we also have Tommy Krogan.
I can change my name back finally.
Well, believe it or not, that's how I spelled your overlay. Krogan. So there you go. Just so we don't.
There you go.
And,
Problem solved.
Tommy, you're from Colorado, right?
Yeah, northeast of
Excellent.
Denver.
Excellent. All right, let's do the thing. Let's get the stuff out of the way. Let's get all the vegetables out of the way so we can get to the dessert. So we have 2 new patrons this go around. So if you go to patreon.com/brotherswisp, throw us a couple of bones, you get access to our patron-only Slack, and these kind folks have done that. So we have Sarah Kerr, the famous or maybe infamous Sarah Kerr from WISP Talk and all that stuff. She's been doing tons of new videos. So I actually watched her splicing video this morning on the Signal Fire stuff, so it was pretty cool. I like seeing people pick stuff up, turn it around, so I don't have to do that. We also have Jeffrey Willis, a new patron subscriber. So thank you guys very much, and thank all of you for listening that are patrons. So we actually have a handful of. Let me scoot you over, Tommy. You're covering my my sponsor list here. So we have Cambium, which is the ePMP bundle. They're still running that guy. $6,000 value, $2,000 price tag, 6 months of VISP.net, automated billing, RF Elements Twist Horn. You get 2 hours of one-on-one with an ePMP network engineer. Remember, that's no sales pitch. That's just you talking to another guy, talking shop with your strange accents and your odd colloquialisms. You also get a CN heat trial that I hear is pretty legit. So check those guys out. The link's going to be down in the description. We also have Sonar, a scalable and intuitive comprehensive ISP billing and operational support system. You can find those guys over at Sonar.software. I think they are our oldest sponsor, so go and show those guys some love. We also have QuickBit. We did a sponsored podcast with them not so long ago, and I was checking up on their website. They don't have the online store just yet, but they do have the new K60C radios listed on the site. I think Chad was talking about he was going to buy up all their stocks, so you get to fight that guy for them as soon as the store hits. They are, in case you missed it, indoor and outdoor 60 gigahertz kit that is pretty much set it and forget it. You just throw it in place. It's pretty solid at a great price, crazy features with API, development tools, solid distance, up to 8 clients per hub. So go check those guys out at quickbit.com. And then last but not least, towercoverage.com. You guys know Tower Coverage. It's your RF propagation system and empower your network real-time data metrics system, enabling you to find your coverage area, reach your customer area base, and more. The industry's best RF propagation mapping system allows website integration for customer sign-up and pre-qualification. Use this data to scientifically plan network expansion and help your WISP success. So you got to wear your lab coat while you're doing it. They'll give you a free trial if you just pop over to towercoverage.com. So all of that stuff and more is available to you. All right, guys, let's talk about some stuff.
I wanted to point out the irony with our sponsors in that we were seeking sponsors to help fund the equipment and people to do recordings at the shows. And and we're getting more sponsors now because there's not shows, and so they need to get their word out somehow. So it's like, okay, well, I guess that's working better for us, but I guess that means first show that actually happens post-COVID, we'll have to hit it out of the park.
That's not going to happen. Don't worry about that.
I think Greg's just done like 10-year contracts with all of them, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
You're all stuck.
Absolutely. Well, anybody that's going to slum enough to be part of this podcast, they're pretty desperate. So I'm not terribly worried about it. Let's see. So a little bit of the nuts and bolts. I've been doing a lot of automation stuff, so I always like to talk about it just to see if it sparks anything new. I'm always curious to see what you guys are interested in automating. So this go around, I did a CyberArk Conjur deployment, and I got to tell you, man, it was a huge pain in the ass. I followed their step-by-step guide that said it should take 10 minutes. Fast forward a day and a half, and I still didn't have it working. So I'm sure a lot of it was just me not understanding containers. So this was really my first foray into containers. Nick, Braulio, you've been talking about how you're containerizing all of your stuff. Well, this is new to me. Well, honestly, the container part stood up really fast. There were just holes in their documentation. So it's really cool because it stands up a Conjur container, right? And so Conjur is their secrets engine. It's their open source secrets engine. You can get the commercial edition that gives you the GUI that actually makes all this stuff simple. So I would have been done probably in 10 minutes as opposed to the open source version. But there's a couple of caveats. So it does the self-signed certificate, and you have to create a host entry and come from the word proxy. That has to be the fully qualified domain name you're trying to get to is proxy. And then there's this special way that you pull the certificate out of the Nginx container that gets created that you have to actually utilize. So I had built it and recreated it and tore it down over and over and over. And then ultimately I was able to get a CyberArk guy on the phone, like get him on a web conference, show him what I was doing. He goes, yeah, just do this and this. I was like, oh, okay, great. Yeah. Maybe you guys put that in the official documentation or,
No, because then everyone would use the open source version and no one would buy the GUI.
And he was like, dude, I don't ever mess with the open source stuff. And I was like, you know what? My product is like Tower. It's like I'm not out there installing the upstream open source version of that either. So it's like I get it. It's like that's not what feeds my kids. So I don't spend a lot of time on it. So I totally understand.
Tower's legit, man. Tower's worth the money in my opinion. I mean, I don't own it, but my workplace does. But you learned lesson number 2 of containerization. You already learned lesson number 1 because you wouldn't be doing containers if you didn't. Lesson number 1 of containerization is it's not a system. It's an application and all the ancillary crap that goes along with it and nothing else. That's the hardest lesson to wrap your mind around if you're old school like us, right? It's not a VM. It's not a bare metal system. It's like a ball of fuzz that there's pieces sticking out of. Lesson number 2 is that none of it's documented, and there's all kinds of weird intricacies that are very difficult to sort out because people go to containerization to simplify their own lives, and they don't care if anybody else is using it or not.
Yeah. Well, and I guess to take it even a step further, Nick Arellano, you started using like lambdas, and I mean that's even more of a kind of a stripped down concept as opposed to containers, right?
Same concept, just one's controlled by Amazon and it's a little more proprietary, but it's still a container.
So it still feels the same. You're just out in the cloud.
Yeah, it's just a little different to spin up because you're executing like functions of code rather than spinning up like a VM. But containers are nice. It's kind of the way of the future.
So you're saying I should figure it out?
Yeah,
I definitely
for sure.
need to figure it out. Then I can't weasel my way around. Is what you're saying?
Well, the benefit of a container is that everyone that works on the project as you can work in the same exact environment as you. As long as you have Docker installed, doesn't matter if you're on Linux, Mac, Windows, the environment that you're using is exactly the same because Docker is like containerizing it. It's running in the Docker engine. It's using the same dependencies. Like I use it for local development now for specific things. Like I have a Postgres database, a MySQL database, a MariaDB database, and I run on Mac. So with Docker, I can also test on Microsoft SQL Server, which doesn't run on Mac, but I can containerize it. And I can spin it all down and not use resources all the time by installing it locally. So it's pretty great, but it is different than obviously bare metal.
What I've heard people describe it as too is you start thinking about things a little bit differently. They what do they say? Think of your infrastructure as cattle, not as pets, sort of thing. So like,
yeah, that's lesson number 3.
But it's so hard. It's so hard. I mean, it breaks the brain. I don't know that I'm fully ever going to get there, but I'm hoping to.
Wait until you start poking in the networking stack.
That's one of the things I hate about Docker.
Really, what's that?
That's one of the things I hate about Docker is the network stack and the disk mapping stack.
The networking stack is a dog turd wrapped in a cat turd. I mean, it's just the worst. It's Linux. First of all, it's Linux Bridge, which by itself is ancient and awful. And then by default, it wants you to NAT everything and punch holes through the NAT, which I have an extreme disdain for address translation when it isn't actually necessary. So when you start poking around on it, you're going to have to do all these weird port mappings, and then you got to track ports. And if you're going to run it in production and you're doing it that way, then you got to track the ports, right? You got to have a source of truth to track the ports. So what I've decided is that I will never do it that way. I will use Mac VLAN every single time. I'll allocate however much address space I need. It's either RFC19 or /64. Either way, I got plenty. And I'll just use Mac VLAN. And what that does is Mac VLAN essentially creates what I consider to be more of a host stack, right? So it gives every container an individual IP address. You don't have to mess with any ports, right? Because you get them all. And it supports IPv6 much, much better than the other mechanisms do. Or at least last time I tried to use it, tried to use Linux Bridge, it was exercise in frustration, so I just gave up, and I've never used anything but Mac VLAN since.
That's funny when you talk about how much you hate natting. It just makes me think of like John Osmond and how that dude will knife fight you over natting. He does not like natting. He is definitely not a big fan either. It's you old school guys, man.
He and I kind of came up in the same time period. Well, he's probably got a few more years on me, but like NAT wasn't a thing when I started. Like it was brand new. Like people were just starting to do it. And like I remember my first broadband, like you could just plug in and I could pull, I could have 8 machines. We'd have LAN parties. My girlfriend and my wife now used to call them nerd parties. People just lug their big gaming machines over. We're talking like 1998. Plug them into our hub, and then everybody just got a public IP address off of our DSL line. We had an SDSL line. It was like a /20 or something, and everybody just got public IPs.
So you're basically old men telling people to get off your lawn, is what you're saying.
Get off
I'm
my
fine
internet.
with that. I'm totally fine with
Old
that.
curmudgeons.
My biggest problem with it is that it's overused, right? And unfortunately, people that came in later in the game, it's been drilled in their head over and over and over that you have to have it. And even worse, it's been marketed by the vendors is that it's a security function, which is absolutely not a security function. It's a translation tool. And so that's really my problem is it's a tool, right? And it's a tool like anything else. Like it is what it is. It's good for some things. It's not good for others. But I don't like the misuse of it, or what I perceive to be the misuse of it by people that don't really understand it, right? If you don't have any IPv4 space, you got to have it. If you can get IPv4 space, why would you ever use it, right? It's not going to secure you any better than anything else.
Yeah, it was.
Don't worry, you have NAT helpers.
I mean, the
What's that?
Don't worry, you have all those NAT helpers too.
God, the
everything for you.
ALTs are just the worst.
But it's
No
like
problem.
it was always. I mean, NAT was always a stopgap, right? It was just a means for us to get ready for IPv6 and buy some time. Which, yeah, who's it? Steve Disher told me this a million years ago because I used to actually work with him, He said, a temporary solution is the most permanent fix. And I'll be damned if I don't still have duct tape on stuff 10 years later. So it was 100% true.
I just went downstairs and this afternoon replaced the faucet and whole setup in my sink because I put a temporary solution in like 3 years ago, and we realized this afternoon that it had leaked everywhere inside and basically ruined the inside of the cabinet. And I was like,
yeah. Should put a little post-it, little to-do. You write a note on the back of your hand. That's what I used to do. I actually used to do that. I used to carry around a little notepad, a little spiral notepad, one of those pocket-sized ones with a little mini pen in my pocket. But yeah, dude, I used to keep it with me all the time. It was like permanently bananaed from being stuck in my pocket. But
I love writing things down physical.
I do too.
Media. So I switched to Rocketbook. So like this thing, because I have like boxes of these notepads. So I bought this thing that's called Rocketbook. It's basically like an erasable whatever. Yeah. And you just take a picture of it and it shoves it up to Google Drive and then you're done.
These Rocketbooks, and I still haven't like used it yet. Or you know what? I have been using it. I just haven't taken any pictures. I'm basically still using it like just a piece of paper.
This is this year's notes for me. I have a problem.
I don't agree. I think you're doing it right.
I don't think it's enough notebooks.
The only problem is you can't go back and find anything.
I mean,
so it's not really necessarily.
Yeah, searching it is terrible, but I'm getting better about scanning.
That's why you got to blog more.
Yeah,
convert it to blogs, make it indexable, searchable. I need to do
honestly,
that.
that's why my blog started 10, 15 years ago, however long, is documentation about the Juniper SRX that didn't exist.
And now you can document everything else that doesn't exist, which still continues to not exist. Whenever you find the little caveats in vendor stuff, which is amazing, right? I love it when I'm Googling for stuff and I still find like guys' personal blogs or girls. I don't want to engender anybody, but just the idea that it's knowledge that people have acquired over time and they're probably really just documenting it for themselves. And how many times, Mike, I know you've done it, have you Googled for a problem, like the solution to a problem, and you find your own post on it?
I was just gonna connect that conversation about the containers with this. I just Googled it. In 2007, I wrote a whole wiki article on the OpenVZ project about how to migrate from one hardware node to another. And I had, when I was doing it again later, I totally forgot I had done that. I'm like, how do I do this? So I'm searching for it. And I'm like, man, this example looks exactly like my environment. And then I see like the server name, and I'm like, okay, I guess I wrote this article.
Is it Proxmox or something?
No, OpenVZ was like the containerization of choice before LXC was a thing. Right. Like I even used it natively before I even heard of Proxmox. Okay. And like once I heard of Proxmox, and I was like, oh, I can do all this in a web GUI, and I don't have to sit here with a calculator and Excel and figure out like, okay, how many pages is this and how many things is that, and how do I? It's just megabytes. Okay, type it in. Moving on. That made it so much easier. And yeah, on the containers, I've got one for authoritative DNS, one for resolving DNS, one for this, one for that. Just every individual task gets into a container.
You know what I'll say?
Yeah.
And that's really the way to do it.
It's sort of like taking the new concepts and applying to the old things. In our lab, we use a lot of Linux images and stuff like that. So we'll create templates. So basically, just the concept of in your virtual environment, you create a virtual machine and you basically just turn it into a template. And then you can clone the template or link clone it, whatever you want to do, and utilize that really quickly. So it's almost like sort of a container, but I guess it's not running as light as a container. But that's what we do in our lab, and I can spin one of those guys up. I can link clone like a Linux VM in a minute and have it up with all of my security policy ready to go. And so I can kind of like fake my way around all of the oddities of Docker and things like that. But I thought it was interesting. I Ansiblized the CyberArk Conjur install. So now you just run the playbook, and I think it takes about 8 minutes. And it goes out, it pulls everything, clones their repo, does the Docker compose pull. I mean, it just does all of that. And at the end of it, you even have some example stuff set up. And it's just, it's so crazy to me how, I don't know, how just generic all this stuff is. How it really is turning into Lego blocks. You know, you could just go out, you grab whatever color, shape. Oh, I need one with, 4 pips on top. All right, and you just start snapping all that stuff together. It's super trippy how all of it's going together. It feels a lot more like networking now, right? Where I need a router. All right, well, I'll grab a router, I'll put it in here, and I'll do my base configs. And then, I don't know, it's starting to make a lot more sense than servers used to kind of my network having brain. I don't know. It sounds like you've been more of a kind of a renaissance man for a long time, Braulio. Does that track with you?
Well, I don't know if I'd say renaissance man. I would say I'm someone who has a very loud voice that sometimes plays with toys. But yeah, I definitely agree. I think that the biggest shift is one that you mentioned. It's the cattle, not sheep, right? Because a lot of people are like, oh, I got the server, right? And this is special, and I have all my things on it, and it runs these applications for me. But now it's just like, okay, I have this bare metal box, and I don't care what's on the underside of it, right? Especially if I'm going to do something in the cloud, it's X amount of boxes. And, I'm basically going and I'm picking things off a shelf. Okay, I want to run Nginx. I want to run a MySQL server. I want to run, whatever else. Now click, 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 or type. Bloop, there it is. It's all done. And here's where my config folder is. And then it's business as usual, right? You just go in and you edit your nginx.conf or whatever else. And when you want to upgrade it, you just shut it down. You blow away the image. You pull the new image. You start it back up, and it just points at your configuration directories, and it's upgraded, and you're done. Yeah. I mean, it's very, very turnkey like that, and I definitely think that is absolutely the direction that we're going in right now, in my opinion. I mean, everything is. Just go to GitHub and look for projects, right? Even old ones are like, oh, okay, well, here's a Docker file now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like within Red Hat, I see a lot of push, a lot of initiative, a lot of momentum towards our OpenShift product, right? Which is us taking Kubernetes and enterprising it, and adding some additional cool features and support and stuff on top of it. So, I mean, we're getting a lot of adoption. And after the IBM acquisition, we're seeing a lot. I mean, they're starting to push a lot of stuff our direction that way too. I guess that partnership, we're actually starting to try. It's the scene in Predator where we're locking muscly forearms right now. So we're actually kind of coming together as a team. It's interesting. I mean, I would assume everybody's feeling each other out. Because normally, and this is sort of pseudo from an outsider's perspective because I'm new over there, but normally whenever I see mergers and acquisitions, the company that gets bought, I mean, you see a lot of attrition really fast, right? They're getting rid of redundancies and stuff like that, but it looks like Red Hat, they basically kept them whole, and so much so that they even pulled one of our people, I think, to be the president over there at Red Hat, or CEO or something like that. So, they're trying to inject some of our culture over there, which is cool. So it's just sort of a different way of looking at things.
IBM's an interesting bird, because they're crazy old. Like, they've been around forever. They have a huge, huge market share. Their name, carries its weight in lead or gold. I mean, lead's technically heavier, I think, so that's why I used it. Not that they're not gold. But, it's heavyweight, right? But what was their Unix offering? AIX on PowerPC hardware? I mean, it's a smart buy for them, right? Red Hat is a great fit because Red Hat is the enterprise supported. It's got the biggest install base, right, in enterprises. And let's be honest, enterprise is where the money is for the vendors, right? All the, listen to packet pushers, right? They talk about enterprise 99.9% of the time. It's where the money's at. And it's a crazy smart buy for IBM to integrate and then just leave it as it is. right? Because it's probably already making money.
Yeah, if anything, they're they're probably just. I mean, honestly, you know what? Never mind. I'm probably not supposed to speculate about this stuff as an employee. So I'll sidestep that one. All I know is the corporate culture there. It's bonkers. It's unlike anything I've ever seen anywhere else, and it's insanity. Like, oh no, I'm probably not supposed to talk about that. Never mind. I don't know.
You keep going this route and then backing away.
It's like, it's fascinating to me. So we're looking to hire some folks. I mean, there's a lot of hiring going on right out there, but kind of in our area that we deal in, they're talking about, hey, we've it's like us. We're a team of like 3 30-year-old white guys. We need some diversity. So they're like purposely like, we need people from varied backgrounds. They want diversity. Not just for the sake of having diversity, but so that you can get different perspectives. There's like, let's look at some older folks. Let's look at even some younger ones. Let's, just trying to make it as representative of the customers we're seeing as possible. It's like, I've never worked for a company where they're like so in tune with what they're trying to do that, they're really like micro looking at even the people that they employ. I don't know how I slipped through the filter, but I'm in there, so I'm not complaining about it. It's just, I don't know. It's just such a fascinating turn of events for me. It's so different than what I'm accustomed to. I don't know.
So my takeaway from what you just said is you were staring directly at Nick A when you said they're hiring people.
I don't know, man. I keep trying to I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm saying it's an amazing place to work, a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of people with hipster beards just like him, so I think he would fit in just fine.
I'd love to be the dumb guy again.
It's not hard.
Isn't that the best?
Place. Holy crap! There are some talented individuals.
Dude, I've been at my job for pushing 8 years now. I'm still the dumbest guy there. Like, I love it. I mean, I want it that way.
It's just like it's a balance. So as your intelligence goes down, just the volume of your voice needs to go up. So you just augment it by being louder. That's what works for me.
I never have a problem being loud.
Oh man. Well, Nick, while we have you on here, I love your hot takes, and I like it when you get spicy. So I have a couple of things in here that I think are I think you're going to have a better insight than pretty much anybody else, and I've talked to because you've worked in some of these environments. But I listened to Thomas Kernek, the guy who runs and owns Unimus. We all know and love him. Our Slovakian friend, he sponsored a Packet Pushers podcast, and it was about free-range routing, so of course I listened to it. And I found it interesting, not necessarily from what the product can do, just from the concept of open source routing. And it made me start thinking about, hey, I work for an open source company. I 100% believe in that stuff. I'm totally on board. But what makes it different is, while we're an open source company, we're open source first, we're packaging support on top of that, right? So while it is open source, you're getting it enterprise ready, and it's good to go. And so it made me think about this free range routing that they were talking about. It's an open source routing engine. And I mean, there's multiple vendors that actually utilize it in their product, like Cumulus or VyOS. So it's out there. So theoretically, you're technically getting support for it. But I was curious, who would actually be willing to just take the open source and roll it in their network? Sans vendor support, and would you ever consider doing something like that? I was just curious. And what are the
for sure.
What are the things that you would have to consider whether you would do it or not?
So I've done this already. I did this many, many years ago, and for specialty applications. So, for example, a previous employer, our entire DNS infrastructure was all Anycast, and it relied on the Quagga stack, which is what FRR, free range routing, is forked from. So Quagga sort of was a thing, and then sort of dwindled for a while and didn't really get updated. And then it kind of did again, and then it didn't. And then they forked it, and it became free-range routing. And free-range routing gives it, they kind of are doing the same model that some other open source projects are, where you get vendors to sponsor people to actually work on it. And you get folks like Google who will go in and they'll say, well, we need this open source routing protocol, so we're going to dedicate some resources to building it, and then we'll just open source whatever is proprietary to us. And so they did that with pieces of FRR. Cumulus supports a huge amount of development in that project. But to sort of get back to running it, like I ran Anycast off of Quagga. The entire route views project is moving over to FRR. So folks that aren't familiar with route views, it's been around forever. It basically has nodes all over the world that have perspectives on the global routing table that you can for free just use, and you can get route table dumps and go into virtual routers and do show commands and stuff. It's incredibly useful. And I've sort of facilitated some of the coordination between the FR folks and the route views. I'm on the route views steering committee, so like I got them together and they're adding BMP into it. And so like this stuff's been around and it's been in production a long time. Some other things I've done with it is black hole routing. So there's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to run, route views off of it, which isn't actually transiting any traffic, right? It's collecting data. It's a whole other thing to say, I'm going to use this open source routing stack and it's going to do it's going to influence what's happening on my network, right? So Anycast, okay, yeah, that's important, right? Because if it's not MTU, it's DNS.
But explain what Anycast is, right? So you're talking about that. Like, think of I always think of Google's 8s, right? 8.8.8.8. That's like an Anycast, right? Yep. So how does that work under the hood?
Yeah, so basically what you have for an Anycast is the ability to run a single prefix in many places. So typically in the global table, it's done with a /24 because that's the smallest globally routable IPv4 block that people will accept. So what you do is you set up a software router. You can do it with a hardware router too, but most people do it with a software router in my experience. And you create your host. You do a /30 like you're going to have a just a single connection, and then you run some routing protocol over that announces that /24, and then you do that in geographically diverse locations. So let's say for us, like we did one in Chicago, one in Champaign-Urbana, one somewhere else, and it announced that /24 out. So any one of those can go away, and it can still. So there's two benefits, right? Any one of them can go away, and it's still a functional service, and you will always use the one that's topologically closest to you because of how BGP routing works. Shortest AS path. So you'll use the one that's closest, and it gives you redundancy. So that's the premise behind Anycast routing, and there's lots of them out there. Google's is probably the most well-known one. OpenDNS, there's our Anycast. Cloudflare's is Anycast. The 9.9.9.9 is all Anycast.
So
it's the same concept, right?
And
it works with v4 and v6.
We're using it, right?
Yeah, guaranteed everyone that is listening to this and their grandmother has all used Anycast, and they just probably didn't know it. So that's one application for it. But the other one is the BGP black hole routing. So if I want to null route something for whatever reason, if it's a DDoS or if it's somebody misbehaving, or if Mike's pissing me off on my network and I want his traffic to stop working, I'll just null route him, right? And you can do it as a null route inside a router, or you can use the like a black hole routing platform. There's a couple of them out there. There's the NCSA BHR, which I helped write some of, which works fairly well. Then there's a handful of other ones that I'm not really familiar with. But you run this process that says, I'm going to read in this list of addresses and I'm going to announce them via BGP as if I control them. And what that does is that says, I have a more specific route for this, say /32, right? So if you're trying to get to Mike's house and he's being a bad neighbor, route his IP address, and it just goes nowhere, right? Because you're now authoritative for that /32. And so I've done open source routing stacks for that for many, many years, and it's worked pretty well. We're in the process of converting over to Go BGP for a couple of things, including flow spec routing, BGP flow spec. So, I mean, the open source stacks are pretty solid. The one thing that you got to worry about with things like Linux-based routing is you're always going to be limited to what the host OS stack can do, unless you're buying a commercial routing stack for it, like IP Infusion or something, and two, what the hardware is capable of, right? So one of my old bosses used to say, I put a 10 gig interface on a rock. That doesn't mean it's going to move 10 gigs worth of traffic. So, the limit is going to be the host stack most of the time when you're talking 10 gig and below. And so that would be my only reservation, right? Is just making sure that it's right sized for what I wanted to do. 1 gig all day long. I'll run a 10 gig probably also all day long, up to maybe 4 by 10.
What's interesting to me about this is I like to try and put myself in other folks' shoes. So if I'm a WISP listening to this, what's my thought process here on whether I should run this or actually go with kind of a vendor supported product? I was thinking about it. I would say, number one, how risk averse are you, right? So right out of the box, if you're just running the open source, right? Like, I don't have a budget and I'm going to run completely open source, no vendor support. It's like, it's all on you, buddy. You know what I mean? There's probably nobody you can call when you're in an emergency. You're going to have to take care of it yourself. So that's going to be one. But, I was also thinking about it. A lot of this comes down to how much time do I have to dedicate to this stuff, right? I'm already familiar with Cisco, or maybe I'm already familiar with Juniper, or I'm really good with MikroTik. It's like, most of the WISPs I talk to, they're basically burning the candle at both ends while their hair's on fire. They just, they don't have time to sit down and learn all this new stuff. So I'm just curious. It's like, at what point do you think somebody would want to choose? Well, and also, whenever you think about too, this is just a routing platform, right? So it's gonna make routing decisions and it's gonna move packets. It's not gonna, it's not a firewall, right? So you have to then layer on top some firewall rules to protect yourself, and you're gonna have to do that via some mechanism that's on your operating system that's separate from this. So, it's just, I think there's a lot of value in having it all packaged together. So I couldn't think of a scenario where it made a lot of sense to just run it as a straight routing system. The idea that you came up with Anycast or black hole routing, that's perfect, right? I don't know, for whatever reason, that just never popped into my head. I mean, what do you which direction would you say people should go on that stuff?
So I think there's a couple of really important things that you touched on there. So if you think about what I said I'd used it for, those are what I would call boutique services, right? They're specialty. They're hard to do inside of a normal constrained piece of hardware you can get from a vendor, right? You can definitely do it, but then you have to factor in the cost of it. Am I going to buy a router just to do this, right? Am I going to, what's my topology look like? Because you're going to do most of those things in more than one location. If you think about running a Linux router, you're probably not going to put one at the border of your network. You might, right? I mean, it comes down to how are you going to pay for it? Are you going to pay in sweat equity, or are you going to pay in, capital expenditure? I would say 9.9 out of 10 small to medium-sized ISPs are going to pay in capital expenditure because they don't have the sweat equity to spare, right? Their sweat equity is spent on, like you said, keeping the wheels on the bus. And they don't want to run this custom solution that, the one guy that set it up, well, he's decided to go work at Amazon now because he got all his experience doing all this wacky stuff. And now you're now you're out of luck, right? Now you got to find somebody to come back and reverse engineer it because damn sure nobody documented any of it, right? But if you have a Juniper that you bought off of eBay for however much, it's probably going to have all the interfaces that you need in it. It's got a very well documented CLI. The network stack works. You can probably get, a bug-free operating system to run on it, or Cisco or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? And you could probably hire somebody off the street, or at least find a reasonably priced consultant to come in and say, okay, my guy left. I need you to look at this. And you can look at the config and you can see what it's doing. So, it really depends on where do you want to spend your effort. Like, I would rather spend my effort on innovation rather than like doing the most whiz-bang custom production stuff. I've already done that, and I have experience doing that. That's what I did with the ISP that I built 20 years ago. Was we didn't have any money, and I didn't have anything else to do, so I just worked like 60 hours a week and we did all this wacky stuff, right? But then when I left, I got calls for like 2 straight years afterwards because I didn't document any of it.
Mark of a good consultant, right there.
So.
On that, we had bought a Ubiquiti Edge Router Infinity one time to run some cache boxes on, just to try something different. It was new. Okay, it's half the price of comparable MikroTik router, but mostly just to try something new. And when we're trying to figure out the configuration, we didn't have the time to just sit there and figure it out ourselves. Nor could we find someone that we could hire to just do it. Like, we tried 3 times to hire people to just, here's what I want to do, make it happen. Because once you have a working config, we're all smart enough to look at it and say, oh, okay, that's how that worked. Now I can troubleshoot it. Now I can duplicate it. But getting the nuances of how all these communities worked and this and that, which possibly didn't even work that well in the platform because it's a platform that's not meant for people that get all that crazy with their BGP configs. So we ended up just selling it because it's like, we're going to spend more time than it's worth just figuring out how to use this. So we went on to something else.
I think that's an important point, right? And a lot of people don't think about that. And I certainly didn't think about it when I was, coming up in the ISP businesses. There's a finite amount of resources, and it doesn't matter what those resources are. They're either money or their time or their people. Where do you want to put most of those? You have to optimally spread them out. And so if it's easier, because an ISP's business, like, the product is the network, right? It's not like, I'm selling widgets on the corner out of a box, right? I'm selling the network and access to it and what it gets you to. And so that needs to be as robust as possible. And so do you want to spend your resources, again, making these whiz-bang things that you could probably get open source projects at the very least and commercially supported projects at the very most, and gray market in between? 9 out of 10 times that is probably the best bang for your buck. I buy the gray market for a small to medium ISP. And we never once, not even a single time, did we buy a brand new piece of equipment at the ISP I worked at. Never once. It was always gray market because it was the best value, and I knew I could get it to work.
Well, I found too, if you go gray market, I can buy the unit I need, and I can put a spare on the shelf for probably 25% the price of a new piece of equipment. So it was just so cost effective, and to have that spare on the shelf was that was very changing for me. Like, that was life changing to be able to actually afford to put a spare on the shelf, because I don't know, I didn't have to worry nearly so much. Like, I didn't have to baby this thing, and every time you'd reboot it, you'd start the instant sweat. Like, this thing totally should have been out by now. I just needed to give it another 30 seconds, and then everything was fine. But every now and then something would fail. I mean, everybody's lost devices, supervisors, whatever it happens to be, power supplies. Sometimes power supply is good, but the caps are gone. But so long as you don't lose power on it, it's going to keep providing power until that one time you reboot the chip, goes down and comes back. It doesn't come back, which is unfortunate. So I guess kind of ultimately what I'm curious about is, do you think, and this is for everybody on the call, do you think there comes a day where this open source routing, whether it's free range routing or whatever the next generation happens to be, where it is a household name like Apache, right? You want to run a web server, you can have Apache stood up in 5 minutes, and it's robust, and it's enterprise ready. Do you think there comes a day where there is an open source routing package that is kind of that snap in? I mean, that is like such a household name like that everybody knows and trusts it.
I would say yes.
Depends.
Because you've got companies whose entire livelihood depends on that happening. If Cumulus doesn't get that software to be a household name that it just works. That's their primary thing. They're going to go away if they can't make that work well. And make it work well enough that other people recognize that it works well. Not that Cumulus itself is open, so it costs money, but all the stuff it's built on is open source. One quick tangent, something else that open source route servers and route reflectors. Every internet exchange everywhere, 99% of them are going to be running some open source
probably Bird
route server. Bird, OpenBGPD. Hopefully there's nobody still using Quagga for the route servers. And then I've noticed more WISPs. Now, it's not a majority by any means, but I've noticed more and more WISPs rolling out route reflectors in their networks, moving to BGP across the whole network, doing more of that sort of stuff. And so, one or two at a time here, we're getting more of them using route reflectors internally. So that's where you would use it as well.
So Nick Arolana.
The IX is a very good point.
Yeah, as you say, Nick Arolana, you had kind of a maybe statement there. What's the background on that?
Well, I think the idea with like the whole white box networking is that eventually you could pick your ASICs, you could pick your parts and build it like a PC, and then pick your flavor of open source routing. But at the same time, if you just need to pass a certain amount of traffic and not do a whole lot of like complicated automation stuff, like they're just going to buy a router off the shelf. But I think as it's more accessible and there's more tooling built around it, part of the sell for a lot of these stacks is that you can do a lot of automation and infrastructure as code. You might have access to things or modules or plugins that work a little bit better, or maybe a lot of times I see it for like route reflectors, because there's some vendors where sometimes the route filter list will bug out your peers. I don't want to say who, but it's like if you get bit a couple times on your BGP configuration and it's costing you a lot of money, well, it might be worth it to have like a specialized like route server stood up on something that's open source, something that's trusted and audited, something that you could build on top of, because a lot of companies now are getting more into additional service in the home, especially some WISPs. Like some people are doing managed Wi-Fi, some people are doing security systems. People are trying to diversify the income and the services and hosting and data center co-location stuff, because there's more companies coming in like Starlink, and so a lot of these companies are trying to bring in more monthly recurring services. And once you kind of get into that realm, you kind of need more tools. You probably need some software engineer people, and so some of this stuff becomes more realistic when you have more talented staff to look at, rather than trying to figure out which big iron device is going to meet your requirements and not have to be replaced in a few years. So it just kind of depends on what your talent pool looks like and what your requirement is as far as the software side. So it's hard to tell if it's just going to be a household name at some point.
Well, not everybody's a network rain man like you, Nick. So
Yeah.
I'm not a network rain man at all.
Yeah.
Just a guy.
I would probably actually take the exact opposite of Nick be here. I think no, because there's just not the pool of users that Apache has. Like Apache, there's probably a billion websites out there using Apache. There's never going to be a billion routers out there that are run by some, half of them being run by some schmuck who doesn't care about web hosting, the web server. He just wants that to work. Nobody, my mom, if she wants a router, she talks to me. But if she didn't have me, she would go to Walmart and buy a router and just plug it in. Like, there's no version of that where I see that level of automation coming, or that level of support coming in for networking stuff that like web servers have.
Well, most people I know that use Nginx, Caddy, Apache, they're not writing all the configs from scratch. I mean, as soon as you get more containerized and templated systems, it's going to be a lot easier to, pick a route reflector container and start using it without configuring it from scratch. I think that's more realistic. But yeah, I mean, obviously the target audience for something like an Apache is much different than like a routing device. But I think it's going to get easier and easier and less risky as people make more open source contributions and help like the spin up process be a lot simpler, the backup process. It's going to be a lot less difficult as far as the entry point goes, I think, for people as the tools get better.
Yeah, let me interject with something real quick here. So if you think about what we all just said, and the comment about your mom's going to go to Walmart and buy a router, right? So back in the 90s, we had this exact same conversation about Linux. Why would anyone ever buy run Linux as a desktop? Why would anybody ever use Linux for anything? It's impossible, right? They're going to get a commercial Unix if they're an enterprise, and if they're a home user and they have a whole lot of money, they're going to get a Mac, and everybody else is going to get a Windows machine, right? And that was largely true. Mm-hmm. But then fast forward 5, 6, 7 years, all of the web servers are running on Linux now, right? How many of them are running IIS at this point? Almost none, right? The install for Linux is essentially turnkey, right? It's come so far that you can, like, my 11-year-old has no problem installing Linux, right? And the same goes for the little routing devices, right? If you think back to the early days of cable modems, at-home network had in their EULA, you could have one device. You could have one computer plugged into it. And so thus became the rise of masquerading and NAT, right? And now you can just go to Walmart and you can literally buy whatever it is, and it is running Linux on the inside, and it's running a network stack that 20 years ago was freaking black magic to most people. So I think there's a chance. Now, protocols are different, right? Protocols, there's a different avenue that they're appropriate. But that may change too. I mean, we used to think, like, why would you need more than one computer in your house? Now, my freaking watch has more RAM in it than my first computer by like 100 times. So I don't know. I mean, I'm only playing devil's advocate. I'm not saying you're wrong, but
yeah.
Something else I thought of too is in what scope are we defining use of open source routing? Remember that AT&T purchased Viata. So now AT&T, maybe they just bought it to screw around with, but most likely they'll be deploying it in all of their network virtualization aspects. So now just one operator themselves could potentially deploy more open source routing than existed in total 5 years ago. So it's like, it's only one entity and not many people are working with it, but just the sheer numbers of units deployed. And by units, I mean, VMs or containers, whatever they are.
Well, they bought it because they were already doing that, and they could use their investment in that deployment that they'd already done.
About, versus the Apache stuff is, in networking, we always think about port count too, right? You're aggregating a lot of ports, and that's not something we traditionally see on a server infrastructure, right? So I guess, that's why you're still going to see network appliances, right, that have 48 ports or what have you. I guess, although most, if you're doing edge routing, you probably don't need 48 ports on that edge device, in your border router or whatever. But I guess that's kind of what's sort of kept some of the networking stuff. Maybe I feel like maybe that's kind of what's held some folks back. But also, what's interesting is I've come to realize recently is that sometimes the upstream open source project is a vendor's biggest competition for their product, right? So like Cumulus, they're selling a product, right? They're packaging everything together. And if the upstream open source gets too good, it gets too easy to use, then you don't need Cumulus anymore, right? So it's so funny, like these companies that contribute to the open source, they want it to be good, they want it to be reliable, but they also don't want it to displace them in the market. So it's kind of a funny cat and mouse game that a lot of the vendors seem to play that I had never even thought about beforehand.
Well, I think Red Hat's done a very good job of that, right? Because, they've got their open source stuff and they're definitely contributing things, but they figured out that their money comes from support, right? You buy a license, they get you support, and that's huge and very profitable, right? So I'm guessing I don't work at Red Hat, but my understanding is that their profit margin comes from support for the most part and licensing.
Although it's not a license, it's a subscription. So there you go. It's all about
I actually didn't know that.
Oh man. Well, let's see. I want to agitate you just a little bit more, Braulio. So in the I think it was this morning in the Slack, we were talking about how I guess it was CenturyLink was having problems. A bunch of guys were having trouble getting to YouTube and stuff like that. They couldn't even get to 8888, right? So your network's having it. That was always I always had monitors for 8888, and when you can't reach that, something's bad. You've got a lot of problems, a lot of people having problems simultaneously. So you're about to get flooded with calls. And we were talking about it, and they were saying, well, I've got, these different peers, and how is it that if, there's such heavy packet loss going to, Google's ASN via Cogent. I think it was Cogent that was actually having problems, or maybe it was CenturyLink. I can't remember. Somebody that started with a C. How is it that it doesn't reroute? Well, it's the idea of if the routes are still on the table and they're still best path, traffic's going to take that direction. And they're like, well, how do you work around that? And so the idea of route optimizers comes. I see the look on your face. I see you shaking with fury. No. And so I just would.
No, that's a very valid use case for it.
Not as a transit provider, though. I think that's the caveat, right? You're not in favor of transit providers running route optimizers, correct?
Well, my problem, it really isn't even with the product. It's the fact that what I equate a route optimizer to is it's like handing a nuclear bomb to an 8-year-old, right? Like, you can blow up the global internet if you don't understand what you're doing with it. And a huge amount of people, like when you had yours, Greg, like you obviously know and understand routing, right? You're a seasoned veteran in understanding how to do routing correctly.
We'll go predicate on.
I mean, you make offerings to the route optimizer.
Yes. But you understand the implications of doing it wrong. And I think that is something that is lost on a very significant number of people that buy them, right? They buy them for maybe different reasons, right? and I think SD-WAN actually solves a lot of these problems for smaller entities, but it's kind of a different use case, but it solves some of these same problems in optimizing. I've got too much latency, or I've got bad connectivity on this path. I'm going to move it to that one, right? Conceptually, very similar, but the problem that I see with them is that they get misconfigured because people don't really understand what they're doing with them. And I will preface this, or I guess add an addendum into this, that this is literally how I learned how to do ISP routing. Was I would do something, if it didn't explode, then I would deem it as good. Right. In the late 90s, there was terrible documentation. That's how you figured things out. I can't even tell you how many times I leaked the global table to my upstream who was not filtering. Right. Many more times than I can ever count. Right. So I'm not innocent or, without fault myself. But that's my issue with route optimizers. It's not necessarily the product. It's the use cases and the knowledge of how to use them correctly. But what you described is an absolutely perfect use case for one, right? And that's a big problem with global routing, is if the route's still on the table, it's still valid.
The last time we had a conversation about it, one of the things that you really didn't like about the route optimizers is generally how they work is, say I've got a /24 subnet and the route optimizer says, oh, I don't want you to go to CenturyLink anymore. I want to switch over to Cogent. So what it'll do is it'll take that /24, chop it in half, and advertise 2 /25s as being from Cogent, right? Even though they aren't truly, thereby shifting your traffic over. And that was the idea of you manipulating the BGP routes and potentially sending those to customers. Wasn't that like a sticking point for you?
It's the second part that's a big problem for me. I don't care what you do with the routes once they're inside your network. As far as I'm concerned, once they're in your network, they're yours to consume how you want to, right? But that comes with a price, and that price is that you really need to understand what you're doing if you're going to do complicated things with the global routing table, right? Because that is a public resource, and it's kind of like going camping and taking a dump on the grill. Right? Don't do it. It's public resource.
Sanitize it. Don't worry about that.
But you get my point, right? Don't crap where you eat. Understand what you're doing.
It's like I wouldn't want anybody handing me any massage or manipulated routes. And whenever I had ISPs that would take my so who was it? I think it was Zayo. By default, they would take your subnets in, and they would alter the local preference of anything they learned from you so that it would always try and come through you. So even if you wanted to prepend your traffic, to make it look less desirable through your direct peer with them, they would still ignore that because they had already adjusted local preference to send it through you. And they had this, they would say, well, since you're the source of truth, I guess, as far as that goes, we want to make sure it goes directly to you. And I'm sure there's some truth to that, but to me it was like saying, hey, it's cheaper for us to transit out of the router we're directly connected to you on, and we don't want to burn up any of our transit links to other people, so we're just going to. But the idea that they manipulate my traffic without my consent just right off the bat is filthy to me, because at one point it wasn't doing that, and then they just decided to implement that on my traffic. And so I had to explain to a customer why they got, I think it was like a $15,000 95th percentile bill from us because they were prepending, and it should have accepted that, right? Because that's generally how the internet works, right? You prepend, and they were adjusting local preference, which they magically started doing one day and didn't tell us, and so their traffic continued to come in through us, and it was a bad time. It was hard to explain. Well, it wasn't hard to explain to them. What was hard was to explain to my management how this customer was right and we needed to forgive that bill. So sometimes those conversations are tough. Yeah.
Oh yeah, because that's a lot of steak dinners they're not getting at that point.
And you don't exactly want to be on a call with that customer, the CEO of that company, as well as the guy running your company, and saying, yes, this customer's right. We need it. It's like you just kind of have to take a stand and say, yeah, this is the right thing, and I guess if my boss wants to yell at me after this call, that's fine. But so it was unfortunate that they put me in that predicament. And so I'm 100%. I don't want anybody flavoring my traffic in any way that I don't ask for. So whenever I was using, the product I use, and I don't know if I talked about it before, it was Border 6. It was acquired by Experio. Yeah. Those guys I think they're out of Poland and France, or they were. It was like kind of a joint team that put it together. And it's sort of like Noxion, but way cheaper. And actually, I think a little bit more scriptable on the back end. So what it would have it do, and I think most people that utilize it are like hosting providers, because it saves them a bunch of money on their transit links, right? So what it allows you to do is you put all of your circuits in there, and you actually can put how much each circuit costs you, and then whenever you're bursting over 95th percentile, how much it costs you. And so what they'll do is they'll engineer your traffic to your cheaper links, as long as it's not sacrificing too much latency, right? So it'll kind of shift your traffic over. So it can actually save, like those hosting providers, it saves them a ton of money. So while you might be paying $4,000 a year for this box, it's saving you, an extra 20 on top of that. So I see why they use it. And I think that's the scary part that you're talking about, Nick, because I think a lot of these hosting providers don't really know how routing works. They don't really care how routing works. They put in this magic box, and lo and behold, it does a thing. But what's funny is a lot of these hosting providers resell service to ISPs because their traffic is inverse of what the ISP sees, right? So now they're funkying up this ISP's network and injecting routes into that. So it goes down a rabbit hole that can be really dangerous. And so I very much am in agreement. A lot of the times we see problems with optimizers. It's just, it's misconfiguration. Somebody didn't take the proper precautions. So whenever I utilized it, what I would do is any routes that were learned from Border 6, right? So it's a centralized server that sits somewhere. And we actually ran it as a physical box because that's the only way they would warranty it at first, because we've been running it a long time. But you dump NetFlow from your border routers. That all collects in there. It looks at the top 1,000 destinations that your transit links are going to, and it actually does TCP-based tests to those resources, which is really cool, right? So ICMP, it's not just pinging stuff because, that's a second-class citizen. It's actually doing kind of TCP connection, just like everything else. So it'll send a TCP SYN, it'll wait for the SYN ACK to come back, and it checks the round trip time, and it will go based off of that. What I liked about it was that you could actually put a percentage of loss. So I could say, hey, if I see X percent of loss through this transit provider to those top 1,000 destinations, react to that. So it was called a probation event. And whenever you hit a blackout event, and whenever you saw one of those, you could kick off a custom script. So what I would do in my scripts is I would filter all the routes coming from the problematic ISP except for default route, and I would set the local preference crazy high. So the idea being, if all of my other providers somehow failed, I still got a default route out of the guy that's having all the problems, so it'll still technically work. And then I would prepend like mad. I think I would prepend like 6 times or maybe 8 out to that provider. So it basically nullified their existence in my network, but it was still technically there. So if all else failed, it would still be up. So it used to, our monitoring would go sideways. Customer would start calling. You start scrambling, trying to figure out what's going on. If it's 3 a.m., add an extra 15 minutes on, because it's going to take your brain a little bit of time to catch up. But you're trying to coordinate or pinpoint which provider's having problems, and then you try and take that guy out of the mix, right? That's probably like a 20-minute process minimum, I would say.
Oh, I think that's very that's very optimistic.
Right, minimum 20 minute to kind of get that, because you don't want to pull out somebody who's actually functioning properly. Imagine you're in an environment where you've only got 2 ISPs. You don't want to Russian roulette on that one. That would be bad, especially if you've got SLAs associated with this stuff. So it takes that maybe 20-minute process down to on average, Border 6 would see it, react within 15 seconds. It would clean all that up, and it would propagate out to the internet, I don't know, within 30 seconds after that. So a lot of times there would be major hits on providers that we were using. And it might even, if you're paired with CenturyLink, and CenturyLink is peered with an ISP that's peered with an ISP, and it's that third ISP that's having a problem, it still sees that, right? If the vast majority of your traffic, for whatever reason, goes that direction, it can still see that and react to it, right? So it doesn't even have to be the guy you're directly peered with that's having problems. And a lot of times, whenever it would react, customers would never even see it. We would just see it shift traffic. I'd get the notification. I'd say, oh, well, glad I didn't have to deal with that. All right, let's go eat lunch. You know, it was crazy.
That's nice when that happens that way. So I'd like to make a comment about, so we talk about, you know, these things can do bad things if you don't understand how to use them, blah, 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 blah. That's not really, this is not going to be the reaction that you're expecting out of me. That's not really a problem with the optimizer, and it's not even really a problem with the user. I mean, it is, right? Because like I said, it's a child with a nuclear bomb, but really it's a fault in the global routing table, right? It's the fact that your upstream provider is not filtering correctly,
right,
or at all, right? It's the fact that you're not using RPKI to sign routes. There's no, you know, validation involved with announcing something. You know, those are things like the Manners project addresses those. And I think once, hopefully, we get more and more and more providers that are saying, you know, I'm going to use IRR data to build your filters, and I'm going to programmatically automate all these filters so that you can only announce what you say you can announce, right? It's up to you to populate your routing registry database pieces. And, you know, one step better than that, you know, then you're cryptographically signing them. And Microtik's even added this into ROS 7. And I think Justin and some other folks have done some work with that. Kevin Myers from IP Architects played with it. And it supposedly kind of just works, which is really nice, because that's easily the least expensive piece of equipment that you can buy now that'll do RPKI. So that's a really, really big deal. But, you know, you have providers now like Hurricane Electric was always the big one, right? Hurricane didn't ever really filter, right? They were always kind of well known, like, yeah, they're real good, you know, they're big and they're inexpensive and they are IPv6 proponents, but they don't do any filtering, right? And that's changed. Like they're requiring people to register their routes now. And I think those things are the real solution, right? Then put your BGP optimizer and do whatever you want with it, right? Because you're insulated. You know, you're no longer the kid with the bomb, right? Now you're just got a firecracker that's gonna you know, burn your hand and maybe blow off just a finger or something.
Well, we had whenever I was running that network, we had customers that would peer with us, and they had, you know, they were multi-homed with other stuff, and the way I prevented me from leaking anything to my upstreams as well as my customers is I would anything that came from the Border 6 optimizer, because it would do all this via BGP, right? It would advertise routes to my backbones that would, you know, then manipulate the traffic after that. But I would put a community string, or not a community string, I would put a BGP community on everything learned from Border 6, and to any eBGP peers, we'd filter that out. So it was just, hey, if it came from the optimizer, it never exists, right, to those other peers. So nobody would ever really see it. So that's kind of how I hid it from going to anybody else. But, I mean, say I accidentally left that filter off, then, you know, I guess that that safety valve is gone. And so if that upstream or that client that's connected to me isn't doing, yeah, all those things you said, they aren't taking precautions, then, I mean, really, I was never to the size where a service provider wouldn't put a filter on me, because I just didn't have that many routes. So I guess I was always kind of protected from myself in that fashion. But
So the key takeaway is it should be used as an engineer's tool, and you shouldn't let it replace engineering. You shouldn't buy it to do engineering for you. It's just a Swiss Army knife that an engineer should use and be careful with.
I think that's true of everything, right? And that's a problem that a lot of small, you know, entities, doesn't matter if they're provider or enterprise or whatever, is they tend to buy technology to solve resource problems, and that's not always. I mean, sometimes you can get away with that, right? But it's 30 seconds to a fix rather than 30 minutes because you're, groggy and you got to boot your machine up and it's running updates and whatever else. It's a tool, right? It's not a solution to necessarily replacing resources that you can't afford or you don't have for whatever reason.
I mean, that's also the dream of automation, right? Is that it's going to take these human tasks and make them more efficient, more reliable, and it doesn't always work that way. But
well, I mean, in reality, it's doing that, right? It's automating that process for you. So I think that's a real good analogy.
Well, I think for me, it's like when you see people who say, well, I can buy appliance X and then I don't have to pay a network engineer a salary because this box replaces their job. And that's, I think, the people that cause the most trouble. Because that's unfortunately a common thing. It's like, why hire 2 more staff members when I could... This vendor told me if I buy this box, I put this box in, it's going to do their job better than they can do it.
I have literally been to, it was a field day, one of the network field days, where one of the presenters, that was their pitch, is now you don't need the expensive CCIEs anymore. And I was sitting in I never finished my CCI, but I'm sitting in a room with like there's like 20 of us in there. At least four of them are CCIEs. You can imagine how well that went over.
Could turn the punch bowl.
It never really made it past that in the presentation.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what I do now. I sell automation, and that's one of the first things I try and talk to people about is, you know what, you are the subject matter expert. Under the hood, you still have to know what knobs are getting turned, what order things go in, and most of the time, this automation, while it's great at putting it in place and tearing it down, that's not what most people, or rather that's what most people focus on. It's the troubleshooting part that most people don't focus on automation. Most people don't automate the full troubleshooting stack because it's so, spinning something up and tearing it down, there's usually, probably within your organization, 3 or 4 ways you could accomplish that. Wherein if something goes wrong, to troubleshoot that baby forks so fast, and then that tree then forks, and then that tree then forks. You're right, the sheer amount of possibilities to take care of all that stuff. So you never replace humans entirely within the process. They still have to intelligently know how things need to stand up, and then they have to figure out what to do when things go wrong. Your automation generally isn't going to fix all that stuff, at least at the scale that most of the folks I talk to are working at. Maybe the Googles and the Microsofts and the Facebooks, they probably have that stuff automated too, right? But that's an edge case to me.
That's definitely an edge case, and I don't like when that gets used as examples for that exact reason. Like, how many of us have that kind of environment? No.
Yeah, like,
nobody.
I just hired 400, Python programmers to just work on this problem. It's like,
Google literally fabricated their own hardware for one of the revisions of their backbone so that they could do the OpenFlow stuff that they were doing.
Yeah, it's bonkers. Like at Nano, when you see those guys do presentations, it's like, are we even from the same planet? It's so crazy.
My favorite example of that, I think, was Microsoft. Was it Microsoft or Facebook? I forget which one. Talking about open source line terminal equipment, I think they called it. Your optical gear for undersea fiber networks. And they said, we couldn't get the information that we wanted to out of any existing vendor, so we just built our own. Wait, so like Sienna, Infinera, go on and on. None of these people would, Fujitsu, nobody who's been doing this for 30 years did what you wanted it to do, so you just made your own. Okay, no one else here is going to do that except for the other, 5 mega huge companies.
It's a novelty to hear about, but it's unrealistic for 99.999% of anyone else doing technology,
I look at
networking
it like
stuff.
watching the Olympics. I think it's fascinating. I love cheering for those guys. But there's no way in hell me or anybody I know is going to be doing that balance beam routine. You know what I mean? There's only one Usain Bolt that exists, right? It's just, I get it. It's fascinating to look at, but it's you're in a different world, man.
I think the point is like the automation should be like, how do I work safer? How do I work like more efficiently? Like, how can I go from working, 120% productivity all the time to maybe like 80? Because yeah, I mean, nobody wants to do configs at 3 o'clock in the morning. So if you have just enough automation tools to be a little bit safer, to be able to go back on changes, I mean, that's where the focus should be. Not like, oh, my product's going to replace your whole staff. Like, no, my product's going to make your team work better and safer, and you can get more done without stressing your people out.
First getting going at Red Hat, I kind of put it into the Slack. Like, what do you think are compelling reasons to automate? And one person, and I actually say this in my presentation now, because I think it was brilliant, because it really rang true with me. It's like as I became a manager of engineers, one of the toughest things I had to do was figure out how to keep my guys from getting bored, right? Just doing the same grindy bullshit, keeping the lights on. They get tired of that. And so what do? You automate those portions that suck, right? That nobody wants to do. Yeah.
Mundane.
The day to day. If it's like a normal thing where you're clicking and you're following and it's a pattern, you can automate that stuff, right? So just start small, automate this, get rid of it. Now nobody has to do that piece, and then automate the next one, and automate the next one, and then start tying them together. There's no sense in doing all that stuff. And so I look at everything through new eyes. So this morning when all that stuff was going down in that talk, everybody basically shared screenshots of down detector. Like, that's one of our things we'd look at still, It's like a human goes to look at down detector to figure out what's going on. So I just Googled down detector API, and lo and behold, they have an enterprise version where you can interface with that stuff through automation. Or, like if you've got some existing tool chains, you could have it part of the process. If you're monitoring, see something go down, you could have part of the process be, let's 8888, I'm getting packet loss. Let's go to down detector, check that guy out. Let me look at my region, see what else is going on, right? So it can do all that information correlation that a human would do before, only it's going to do it at 3 a.m. and it's going to do it instantly, and it's going to triage that problem for you and present you with a solution. So this stuff is awesome. I love it. I love seeing how it all clicks together. So I have something that's thought-provoking. That's kind of a more discussion-based one. I love these, especially when we got a lot of people. It gets me tingly. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. Most of them aren't technical, right? Because I get so much technical all the time. I try and break free a little bit. And one of my favorite ones is 99% Invisible. I'm not sure if you guys have listened to that one or familiar with it, but it's really about architecture and kind of like the hidden things behind there. But they really digress from there. And this one was called The Lost Cities of Geo. And it was all about geocities. I'm sure you guys remember that from the late 90s. I guess it was late 90s into the early 2000s. It was basically they kind of gave the history of it and then ultimately what happened to it. So, I mean, really, it was some guys that decided they wanted to make kind of community on the internet, right? So they had like communities that people could just create websites sort of within that community, like little neighborhoods, right? Was the concept like, hey, you live in my neighborhood, let's talk. So it'd be like if you were in college, right? Like university-based stuff, or if you really liked pets, or you were into cars. I mean, that you could go up there and put up your little GeoCity website. And what's so funny is you can crawl that stuff through the Wayback Machine or whatever like that. But at one point, it got bought by Yahoo, I think in the early 2000s. And of course, everybody was worried that things were going to change. And of course, everything immediately changed. They sent out a new user policy that said you have to create a new account or log back in or something like that. And by the way, all the content belongs to us. And I think people revolted, and then they kind of crawled back on that, which I think is ironic because now all the social medias, that's basically boilerplate for them. They own everything you put on there. But what was really interesting is, the writing came on the wall. They were losing money. And so I think about 2009, they shut it down. And so there were a bunch of guys that immediately swooped in kind of formed this community, and they all started trying to pull it all down. And ultimately, they everything that they were able to capture, they put up, I think, on a torrent on the Pirate Bay, right? Just for anybody to grab and do whatever they wanted with. And so ultimately, some of that stuff ended up on some websites. So there's some sites you could go to kind of look at those, as well as the Wayback Machine. And ultimately, one of the guys that became like an archivist in this system, he works for archive.org now. So he's one of the main guys that takes care of the Wayback Machine. But it was fascinating to me to think about. So we always say, and I definitely tell my kids this, anything you put on the internet lives forever. But when you get right down to it, it doesn't live forever. And these websites, right, the social media and stuff like that, everything you put content on, there's no guarantee that that's going to be there a year from now or a week from now or tomorrow, right? And so I was just thinking about it kind of in terms of ephemeral communities, kind of like our Slack, right? There's the 10K limit, and I kind of like that, and I kind of don't like that because, right, it's like you only go back so far, but then there's that idea that, you know, all of that history that truly is history, should that be saved for posterity? And just the nature of what we put on the internet and how it doesn't live that long. It kind of, I don't know, man, it evoked these weird emotions in me, kind of this bittersweet sort of feeling. It made me kind of feel nostalgic at the same time as kind of a little sad to think, you know, like I always like to think, you know, how am I going to leave this legacy? And I think I try and do some of it through education online and things like that, but eventually that stuff's going to get scrubbed away, right? And then did I even exist anymore? Like all this effort I'm going through to put stuff up there. Obviously, I'm not doing it just for that. I'm doing it because I want people to think I'm smart. So, I guess always the...
Don't worry, Greg.
There's
always a mirror on the fiber trunks everywhere. They're in a facility somewhere. So don't worry about it. It's there.
Fascinating.
The NSA
I
has
just thought it was fascinating, the idea that
So
the internet doesn't necessarily always have a memory. Yeah.
I didn't even know GeoCities was gone until I saw you put that on the topics. I'm like, oh, it was gone 11 years ago.
A GeoCities one that has 700
even know that.
GIFs, and I loved it. I was just scrolling through them. They had a whole section on South Park GIFs. It's like, oh my god, dude! And every site has an under construction sign. I swear to God, every single one of them, and it's pretty much the same under construction.
and it's a GIF.
Of course,
and it's
what
blinking.
fascinated me too was the idea that websites back in the day, it was understood that it was always under construction. It was always a project in motion. That I guess it was never complete. And now, like, you couldn't get away with that crap. It's like your website better be like smooth and clean and perfect and optimized, and every link better work. You know, it's like we hold everything to such a different standard now. Which
I can't even tell you how many times I got complaints from Hammett that my site theme did not work on his ridiculous phone or whatever the hell he was using at the time. It doesn't work on my Zune. I'm like, dude, I don't care. Go use a computer.
This actually reminds me of an article I was just reading. Here in the Denver area, there's a guy. I don't recall exactly how he's impaired, but he is going and suing small like breweries and other businesses whose websites aren't designed to meet the Americans with Disabilities Act like requirements. And like one of the guys he's suing is like somebody who opened his brewery like 2 years ago, and like all he has is like, hey, we have brews here, and like these are what we have. I don't recall the exact fullness of the story, but I was like, guess that means that I should do something about ADA. So just FYI, bring that up. Like we hadn't. I remember when I was first building my first websites, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many of these little things, because like my instructor was like, you really ought to do this. This is really, really important. So I was like, okay, fine. And it was just like one thing after another. I was like, oh my gosh, is there any way I can get around this? And I think there was like a generator that I ended up using just to do
it's
all
hard.
that.
It's
Yeah.
super hard. If you use all the built-in browser features and you don't use any JavaScript, you're great, but your site's gonna suck. It's gonna have bad user experience. But you have to
Yeah.
worry about like focus states. You have to worry about making sure that everything has proper labels for screen readers. Like it's almost any web-based application, like software product, guarantee you is gonna completely fail accessibility tests. It's just most people on the internet don't do it, and it's kind of sad, but I think a lot of people don't care. But it's extremely difficult to properly do focus states when you do like pop-ups or drop-downs, making sure the focus state behaves well for their device. So most people just don't.
Well, I mean,
But
half the time it doesn't work as is, much less than properly documenting it.
Yeah.
I mean, just because it doesn't work on your Palm Trio doesn't mean that it doesn't work, Mike. So you make sure that it'll work on Mike's, whatever he's happened to be using at that time, his BOS machine.
So how many websites have you guys made over however many years you've been on the internet that have you've let just disappear, like gone offline and all that stuff is just gone?
I've got a handful, and they're all in the Wayback Machine, actually. Which is, except for one, I had in the 90s, I bought this webcam, and I had SDSL, right? Which I was going to run a website.
So you were a cat girl.
Like
That's what
that.
you're saying?
But I had
Fight
this
for OnlyFans.
I had this bird, right? And the bird lived in my room.
You muted
He's
yourself.
He's muted.
Oh, sorry, I bumped the thing. It was this hookbill, cockatiel. It was like this big, and during the day, I had the webcam pointing at the top of the cage because she'd always get out and just like hang out on the top of the cage, and so I had the bird cam, and none of that exists. I have one digital image of that bird on the bird cam, and that's it. But that's the only one that doesn't exist. Everything else I built is in the Wayback Machine, or it's still live.
I think it's interesting because who's to say the Wayback Machine is still going to exist in 5 years? You know what I mean?
Well, it's already failed once. Like it had a catastrophic set of disk failures at one point, and I think they had to restore it all from backup. And you could probably find more info than what I'm remembering, which may not even be right. But if I recall right, like they had some disk failures, there was no redundancy, and they had to restore from backup, and it was like a big deal because like everybody just assumed it would be there forever, and it didn't have the port that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So my wife and I, we were wedding photographers for about 8 years. Did a lot of stuff to make ends meet throughout the early 2000s. I guess well into the mid 2010s. Anyway, I digress. So we had, like all the people's pictures we'd put up in there with like these photo galleries and these montages and stuff. And I don't know, I think it was like 5 years ago, maybe 6 or 7. I just shuttered the website, just turned it off. And I can still go to Wayback Machine and see some of that stuff. And I'll look at those pictures and I'm like, shit, man, we were actually pretty good. It's so funny. I don't know. It's just those little, it's just pieces of history that are going to probably forever disappear. I mean, I've got backups of all of the pictures and stuff in a fire safe, but I don't know. Who's to say?
So does the government.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Well,
I'm telling you, one day I'm going to say, can I buy the Greg Sowell package? And they'll send me a flash drive where I can look at your whole internet history. Wow, this was Greg.
It would be fascinating to be able to I guess see like I don't know, just like your own way back of your personal viewing and all that stuff. Like I think it'd be like an online journal, like if you kept a diary or whatever, but it's like your online life that you could just go back and look at or whatever. I remember there was a project where I can't remember who it was, or maybe it was on Kickstarter or something, but they had like this little camera. I'm sure it was crappy resolution, but you would wear it like right here on your shirt, like right on your collar. You'd clip it on.
That was the Ubiquity.
No,
I was going to say it sounds like a Ubiquity product.
Yeah, that's audience or amp
dependent.
Or whatever that thing. Anyway, it was just a tiny. It was a tiny. It was a little camera. It wasn't. It was like the size of a matchbook, and it would sit there, and every, I don't know, I think it was like every 30 seconds, it would just take like a low-res snapshot of whatever you were looking at. And so the idea being is that you could aggregate that just day after day, year after year, and you'd have like this living sort of diary of everything. Yeah,
Time lapse.
Did, and I always thought that was kind of a fascinating sort of concept, because for good or for bad, I have a very short memory span, like especially for like events and things like that. I think I remember feelings more than I do actual things that happen. And it's so funny how I'll see stuff and it just triggers that stuff for me. You know what also triggers is smells. Smells trigger memories big time for me. It's like a weird thing.
Well, that's like a scientific
Your
thing,
smell
like,
triggers me too.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, smell is like one of those really like concrete things that your brain can use to remember things. Our crappy organic computers that don't work too great.
I did an interesting, speaking of that, I called it a art project, but so I had an old Mac Mini, and I set it up in my living room, and I put a webcam. This is when I first started traveling a lot, and the goal was that I could get on there and I could FaceTime with the family on the TV, or actually it was Skype video, because I'm pretty sure FaceTime didn't exist yet. But one of the things that I was like, well, I got this camera, and it's like pointing at my living room and kitchen, and it's a big open area, and it's a very wide angle camera. And so I wrote some code that would take a snapshot every 15 minutes and then aggregate it together. And so and I let it run for a year. And so I had a stop motion snapshot of my whole, like the main living space in my house for a whole year. It was very cool. And then I was migrating NASs, and I accidentally deleted it. And then it's the only place it existed.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
I guess the early days of the internet felt more like the Wild West, I guess, opposed to now. Especially if you cruise the GeoCities and you look at the color choices that some people made, like neon yellow with neon green font. It's just like, how is that?
Blink and scroll.
Yeah, it's illegible.
I was looking at the first website that I made that was ever public on the Wayback Machine, and I was so glad that those colors were not saved. It's like, God. Oh, man. I remember looking back at it like 8 years later and being like, oh my goodness. I knew it was kind of bad, but this was horrible. Oh, man. I was so glad when it disappeared. No, I don't never want that thing ever to come back up.
Which we'll have in the show notes, link to Tommy's Wayback entry for his website. Yeah.
So you mentioned GeoCities. An interesting sidebar to that is GeoCities is gone now, right? So very stereotypically 90s. The Space Jam website, remember the Michael Jordan movie Space Jam?
Yeah.
Still there, still exactly the same. Go look at it. You'll have a
right
90s
now.
nostalgia flashback.
It's amazing.
Spacejam.com, yep.
Wow.
And you know what's funny is when I was browsing some of those GeoCity sites, they like downloaded MIDIs to my computer. I was like, oh my God, I remember these.
Wow. Wasn't there somebody who did like they sold all the pixels on their website or something like that for advertisers or something like that? And each pixel, and it was in perpetuum. They got like a couple $1 million just because, you buy it was like $1 a pixel or something like that. I can't remember what it was. It was just
brilliant.
Yeah. And so, it's just an entire page of pixels that people bought and they could set to whatever. And he's just hosting it from now on. And he has just, made a bunch of money, and, no one else will ever be able to duplicate it. But it's just like this page from the 90s of wow, this is really, really cool.
So I had a customer at the ISP. He actually ran a competing ISP until he didn't. And he became my customer. And I'm not going to say his name because he's very litigious. But he has case law and stuff that is, he set the precedent for essentially domain squatting. And so he had ended up buying like NeimanMarcus.com, Pepsi.com. I mean, he owned a ridiculous amount of these domain names that were trademarks. And he would negotiate with, in the 90s, he would negotiate with companies, right, and get money out of it. But when he ended up coming to be my customer, he wanted a vhost that just, it's just a home directory. And he pointed everything he had left, which was a significant amount of domains, at that. And that was unquestionably my most trafficked customer because he had so many domain names pointed at that. But if you look up, you can figure out who it is. But he's from where I live, and he he has case law that's based around it might have been Pepsi that sued him, somebody big like that, and ended up being the whole setting the cyber squatting type of legal framework up, all based around this guy that ended up being my customer.
I guess that's the idea of choose your customers carefully sometimes.
Well, he didn't tell me that's what he was going to do with it. Like, he's like, I just need web space. I'm like, whatever, you get it free with your DSL, here it is, right? And then all of a sudden, and I was looking at Webalizer because that's what I used to visualize like who had the most statistics. Everybody remembers that. And it was like his was like orders of magnitude above everybody else's, and I was like, he's hosting porn. And so I went and I looked, and that wasn't at all what he was doing. It was basically just a big domain list.
That reminds me, there was it was probably 8 years ago. There was a customer that was about to move into the data center, and so I was like, oh, okay, cool. And so I started doing a little. I just Googled him. I was like, I'd never heard of this. So I did a little digging. I was like, oh no, this guy, he's hosting porn. He was going to pay us a lot, but I was like, dude, you can't put this guy on my network. Please don't do this to me. It's like I am ill prepared for the DDoS attacks and everything else that's going to come along with hosting this guy's stuff. So they're like, yeah, okay, no problem. And so we opted not to let that guy move into the data center. Thank God. I can't imagine how much hell network engineers have to go through managing like those porn networks. It's got to be crazy.
We should talk offline about that. I also had a very early customer at the service provider that did that. Definitely got some baggage that comes with it.
I bet. Just for the normal people, it's bugger. Well,
yeah. Well, we're talking 20 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
But not only did he host that, he also was, which we didn't know at the time, and this is how I learned about RBLs, real-time blacklists for email. He also was selling mail relays for spammers off of my network. That was actually much, much worse than the other. That took a very long time to undo.
Ended up on a lot of blacklists.
I ended up on all of them.
Everybody's on a list, man.
You're such a conspiracy theorist.
This guy, man, is that a tinfoil hat underneath your headphones there?
No,
it's
don't worry,
chainmail.
it's not.
It's very different.
In case a shark bites his head.
yeah.
All right. Well, we're at about an hour and a half. I'm just curious if any of you guys have any specific things that you wanted to talk about.
I did have one subject, although we're pretty late in the game at this point. But I've had a couple people ask me recently, or bring up when I happened to be around, like moving, basically, I don't want to call it progressing, changing your career path from someone that's pounding on routers and doing day-to-day operations to moving to more theoretical planning, architecture, prototyping kind of environment. And that's something that I've always had those aspects of my career, right? But I'm at the point now where I am no longer doing any production work at all in my day job. And that was a much harder transition than I expected it to be. Significantly harder because one, I got moved into that particular group, and then I still had an on-call rotation every 8 weeks or whatever, and I still went to all the meetings and whatever, and the day that I was moved off of the on-call rotation, I was like, great, because I've been on call since the late 90s with very little, if any, breaks in that. And then it just wasn't there anymore. And I thought, oh, this is going to be great. No more calls in the middle of the night, blah, 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 blah. It's a very weird shift for someone that's been doing it a long time. And that's a topic that a lot of people don't talk about. And I don't know if it's because it's not common or if they didn't have as big of a problem with it as I did. But I thought that might be an interesting
absolutely.
topic.
I got tons of questions. So this is very near and dear to my heart. Because
3 hours later,
recently retired. I don't, you know what I mean? I'm not operating a high stress network. I consider that to be retired. Hopefully, I never go back to that environment. We'll see. But I remember it was probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 days after working at Red Hat. Like I'd made the transition, and my wife and I were out on a walk. Because it's quarantine, so there's nothing else to do. So we went out on a walk, and I got around the block, and then I had this mini panic attack because I felt my pocket and my phone wasn't in it. And then I had this realization, I don't have to have my phone in my pocket. I was like, that's not a thing anymore. And that was bizarre. Like, that was such a strange feeling. And it was...
Must be nice.
Transformative. It was one of those watershed moments, I guess you could say, for me. But what?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I call it nice. It's different. I mean, there are certain things about it that are all right. Not getting woke up, not having to carry an electronic leash around. But it's a very different feeling.
So I'm curious about. So you shifted. You're working at. So for me, I wasn't working at the same place. So I think that division was probably easier for me, right? It was easier for me to make like this mental clean break. But for you, you're at the same place. You're still seeing the same faces. You're still talking to the same folks. So was it like kind of a feeling of loss, maybe?
It was very weird because, like I said, I've always had this as part of my other duties as assigned, right? I spent a lot of time in the lab. I spent a lot of time figuring out technology, new things, and coming up with architectures and that kind of stuff. I've done that for a very long time, but only doing that. A couple things, right? When you're doing both of those things, you have 2 full-time jobs. It doesn't matter how you think about it. That's really what it is, right? Because they're really different. Like architecture, engineering, and operations are all 3 very distinct things. They overlap a little bit, but they're really different. And so taking one of those away, the biggest issue that I had wasn't that I wasn't like actively working on production stuff anymore, although that was there too, much more lower extent. It was that I felt like I wasn't doing enough work, right? Because I'm not doing all the things anymore. And one of the things I realized is that I spent a lot of my personal time doing these things, and now I don't have to do that anymore. Now it's literally what my job is. And it's a nice feeling, but it's also really strange because I find myself having these like middle of the day panic attacks, or like at 5:30 when I'm getting dinner ready, I'm like, I didn't get enough done today. Like I didn't accomplish enough things on my mental list, because my mental list is always way longer than things I can ever get done. But that's been the biggest problem for me, is I will have like these random panics where I'm like, I'm not doing a good enough job anymore because I'm not constantly thinking about work. I'm still thinking about technology a lot, but probably more than a regular person. But like, it's just a strange feeling to feel like you're like, I have pretty bad imposter syndrome. Yeah. I won't lie about that. Like, I didn't go to, I went to art school. I didn't go to school to do this kind of stuff. I just kind of fell face first into it, and it ended up working out okay. And so I've always had that, like, my first real technology job, I had a boss that, like, just really didn't understand why I was there, because I wasn't a computer science student. And he treated me as such. Like, I ran a team, and they all made more money than I did. So, like, I've always had that. I carried that along with me. And so, like, I'll have that, like, panic mode where I'm like, I'm not doing enough things that are going to demonstrate that I deserve to be here.
Yeah,
and that's a real problem.
You know what's so funny is any engineer worth his salt I've ever met has some amount of imposter syndrome, right? And I think if they are worth a damn,
you're not a good engineer.
If they are an engineer and they're worth a damn and they don't have it, it's because they've worked on themselves and gotten through it, right? So I've yet to find somebody who doesn't fit that mold. Maybe I just hang out with all the weirdos, but I 100% identify with that. I know exactly what you're talking. Like everything you're talking about, I'm just ticking it off my list. Yep. So one of the things you talked about was your personal time, that you spend a lot of You know what's funny is before I would go to sleep, I would be thinking about stuff I was working on or needed to work on, and I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would roll over and then I would start thinking about things, or I'd be in the shower and I would be, washing my armpits, and here I am thinking about this stuff, and so I would carry it with me all the time. And that sentiment of, did I do enough today? I still have that. I've switched jobs, and I still, which I think it's good and bad, right? So it makes me do a little bit more. It makes me make sure I get a little bit of stuff ticked off on my work list or whatever. But I used to kind of evaluate myself by, did I complete tasks? And then when you become a manager, you're not the guy that gets the wins anymore, right? So I said on the last, you have to let your guys get the wins. So it's kind of harder to reconcile that stuff with yourself. You know what I found is the best thing for me is having out loud conversations with myself. No shit. I
do that all the time. I'm always talking to myself, but it's funny because I do it in like funny accents too.
I had one.
Well, it's like
I talk to dogs. I talk to the dogs a lot too about random things.
I had one Thursday night. I stopped at an intersection and I looked at my phone and I had a Skype message from Andrew Cox, and he was talking about how his company Gigafy is spending like $500,000 on a project in Alabama, and they do like similar stuff that I'm trying to do, and I am doing it. I'm just not at the scale they are. And I had this little mini attack that was like, it was my brain telling me, you're not doing enough. You need to be, why aren't you at this scale? You're capable. You can do all these things. And I had to like stop myself, because it's like every time these sort of scenarios I'd run into them, I would get this anxiety, like it would sit on me. And I had to tell myself, you know what? You're at a good place. You're doing good things. You're doing everything you need to. Nobody is asking more of you. You're asking too much of yourself, and nobody else is putting that pressure on you except yourself. As soon as I had that conversation with myself, it went away and I feel better, right? But it's so weird how your brain is your own worst enemy when it comes to that stuff. And
Definitely.
I didn't have to.
Ignorance is bliss. Like that. I think it's like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where it's like, it starts off like the amount of knowledge you know versus the amount of confidence you have. So the people on top amount stupid. They're like the most confident people who know the least. But once you get over that edge and you learn to find out how much you don't know, then it's like, oh crap, what am I doing? Or that's how I've always been. Like, I always had this assumption that everybody was way up here and I'm like way down here. It's like I got to catch up. But then you get into the industry and like everyone's just bumping into each other and they don't know what they're doing. So it's like you gotta remember, like, you can learn things and you're gonna forget them, but you have to understand like how much you don't know. And most of those people, that's how it ends up in a work environment, is you try to like push sandbags so you can say, oh yeah, I did this and this and I did this config change. But once you get out of that and you don't have, like, where does the metrics go when you work like in theory? Like, how do you prove, I'm worth this? Because like, is this theoretical stuff ever going to make $1? Like, where do I fit in? And I could see that being really difficult to deal with.
One of the things I struggle with is, and I think this is what a lot of people struggle with, is what is your measuring stick? You know, what is the thing that you measure yourself against?
Right.
And honestly, a lot of us wrap our self-worth up in whatever that happens to be, when that's not necessarily should be where you derive your happiness or your sense of self. But I mean, we're humans, we're imperfect chemical machines, right? So it is what it is. But you know, it's like, what do you like Nick A here? What do you use as your measuring stick for, like? You don't necessarily have one.
I don't know. I still don't know. I'm just I try to learn as much as I can every day, and I try not to stagnate, but I always end up stagnating a little bit. And I think after you've struggled for so long, it's harder to get places where you can get mentorship because maybe the resume doesn't look as good, and it's like it's hard. I mean, I feel like as long as I'm always learning something every day and having fun conversations, I guess it's okay. But I don't know how to measure like when's good enough. You know, I think that's just going to be the lifelong journey.
I mean, you get to decide that. That's the trick,
Yeah.
right? No one gets to decide that for you. You get to decide that for yourself. You could set that bar as high or low as you want. I like to set it as close to the ground so I can just walk over it.
Way to go, Nick.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure this has happened to everybody on this call, but probably the Knicks. I think this is probably an interesting one for you guys. But I've noticed that there was a tough spot for me when I would spend a whole day just talking to people. Like that was what my day would be. Like I would have a workshop I did one the other day that was a workshop from 9 a.m. to 3 in the afternoon. And then I think I had one little meeting after that where I just talked for 30 minutes. And it's like, I didn't create anything. I didn't produce anything. There was no physical, tangible output of what I just did. And I had to understand that I knocked it out of the park. Like I did a really good job on that workshop. I answered all their questions. I followed up. I stayed engaged, right? And for a call that long, you have to act like an idiot and say dumb stuff and make jokes constantly, right? Because these guys, I mean, they've been sitting in front of their computer forever. They're sick of sitting there just like I am. And, you know, you have to try and engage as much as you can. And I had to come to terms with the fact that, hey, sometimes me just talking and being stupid is my job. And that's okay. And, you know, I have to, you know what? I think my boss did a good job too. I have a call with him every 2 weeks and we sporadically talk in between there, not a whole lot. And I'll talk to him and he's like, hey, so what have you been up to? And I'll tell him about the stuff. He's like, great. You're doing a great job. You're killing it. You know, I hope you're having a good time. And blah, blah. It's like, dude, this is crazy. Like, it's so hard to reconcile this stuff.
It doesn't feel like it should be that easy, right? But you definitely hit the nail on the head. Like the days that when you move out of, I like to categorize it as a what and a how, right? So as an architect or strategist or whatever you want to label yourself, you're more like the what, right? I need to figure out the what, and then the operational folks, the engineers and operations and or whatever you want to call them, right? They're the how, right? You don't need to tell them how to do the thing. You tell them what the thing that we think we should have is, get their feedback of that's a stupid idea or here's why it won't work or that's a good idea, and then they figure out the how, right? But that's a lot of that is thinking and a lot of that is talking. And the output of that, like you said, Greg, is there's no, I don't have a widget, I don't have a router config, I don't have, a antenna on a roof, it's a intangible, right? And that's very hard when you're used to producing tangible things. It's very hard to wrap your mind around the fact that that's valuable.
I've noticed too.
Well, and also like you're working against yourself too as an engineer because a lot of the time the people that hire you aren't engineers, and so like the better job you do, the less it seems like you're doing sometimes because you kind of have systems in place, but it's like, oh crap, I have to produce the sandbags, I have to be able to point like, hey, I did this, and it's like it comes to a certain point where you have to like make yourself look busy like a lot of people in technology jobs do, because you have to prove it to somebody And if you do too good of a job, it's like, well, I don't need you anymore because we don't have problems anymore. And it's like, how do you convey that well enough to a non-engineering person that that's because of the work you're doing, and it's not that, they don't need the engineer anymore. So it's like you're always pinned in most places, I would say, that I've experienced at least, where you have to show results, and you can't be too creative and work too hard because you're shooting yourself in the foot, and it's just it's not a healthy thing for people to deal with day to day.
That's an interesting problem when you are working inside a company, right? And I've seen that happen before, where you basically have engineered the network so well they don't think they need you anymore, and they may cut your budget, they may get rid of you, right? But like conversely, that's exactly what you want to do, I think, as like a consultant, right? Like I would never even consider a consultant that did not give me not just what I asked them to give me, but show me how they did it, explain it to me, and give me the documentation, right? I don't want to be beholden to them, to have to call them every time I want something changed. In my opinion, that as a consultant, I will never hire, right? Unless
so
you're
not supposed to grind the support contract.
I'm not a consultant, so I don't feed my family off of that kind of budget. So I can sit on as high of a horse as I want to.
I 100% agree. I think that's that it's easy for a lot of consulting companies to shoehorn you into the support model and lock you out.
Yeah.
And that I 100% disagree with that.
I've worked at one that did that. Like my first job in the 90s, that was their model, right? We provide this. We are turnkey. You don't need an IT department. In the 90s, you get away with that because nobody had an IT department. But in today's day and age, right, that to me comes off as, I can't generate enough. This is the easiest way for me to get money, right, is to basically lock you into paying me always, right? It's the Cisco SmartNet model, right? So however much you pay for your gear, triple that, and that's how much you pay for SmartNet.
Well, it's
right.
I guess it's the old adage: a good consultant works themselves out of a job, right? And
exactly
I don't know
that.
How
exactly that.
True, pure consultants do it, because that feast or famine stuff terrifies me. Like, I might eat this month, I may not. Like, I don't. And Nick Arellano, I know you did that for a while, and you're a better man than me. I don't see how folks do that. So, like, just for my mental health, I don't think I could handle it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that's part of a reason I think that I took a full-time job again for a while, just because it is hard, because I would never put somebody in that position, because I almost got put in that position before I went down the certification path. And so, but it is difficult, and there are some people that are willing to give you a monthly recurring thing just because they trust you and they want you on some kind of retainer, but it doesn't build unless you have like some awesome automation systems or something in place to do more work in faster time. But it does become pretty feast or famine sometimes if you don't do the lock-in model. That's just something I would never do, Tommy, though. So
I see you down there really quick. I want to get you piped in because you're just now starting to dip your toe in this water. What do you think about all that? Like the whole idea of being a consultant and the feast or famine aspect of it.
So I do as minimal as I can as a consultant of work in somebody's network. So I as much as I can, I'm like, hey, this is how you can do it yourself. You can do it. Go have fun. And here's my bill for what I did. For me telling you this would be a great way to do it. Or if I do something, I won't do it like without them being on a call with me, and they have to then listen as I'm working, and I point out this is what I'm working on. Like most of the time I do it on their computer and they see me going through whatever it is. The one time where we had a big project, I was there and I had their full IT department, and I was like, okay guys, this is MikroTik. This is how you do this. This is how you do this. This is how you do this. you are going to learn all this stuff before I leave here, because I'm not going to become your IT department. And that is my absolute biggest terrifying thing that could ever happen to me, is that I become somebody's IT department, because I don't have time to be your IT department. I don't have time to be my own company's IT department. This is me moonlighting and having fun because I want to see fun new networks. I don't want to, that's just not what I'm interested in what I want to do. So yeah, I only do it just because it's fun. And to be fair, like, that's also some of, like, the entirety of my, networking as a job experience. I need money, so it's not entirely all just because it's fun. But, like, I work at my job because I enjoy there, and I get to play with fun toys, and they tolerate my silliness. So, it's a nice thing. And when I give ultimatums, I get what I want because I'm valuable to them. And but, like, that's the other thing. Like, I make sure to show my value in various ways. Like, I'm helpful for lots of things. Like, my GM, I have to go to her to tell. I tell her every time there's a problem customer, and hey, there's this problem. That's what it is. She never hears from them. She never gets. They don't call her, and she doesn't have to talk to them anymore. When I first started working, every now and then she'd have to hear that. Nowadays, people don't recognize that value, and that's a selling point of me, and why I'm a valuable asset to the company, and why they should have more of me. Was my argument. Like, you need to hire more of me, and you need to hire other people for other stuff, because I can't do all this stuff. So, yeah, I'm actually a little bit freaked out because, like, you guys talking about being on call, we've never actually had an on-call at our office, because it's a telephone co-op, and so there's nobody who owns the company, so nobody had enough investment in the company to make people be on call, and we also have just never had the employee manpower to do it. So I'm looking at having to do on-call stuff. Not that I haven't really been doing it for the last 3 years anyways, but it's like, I really don't want to be, like, responsible. I do this because it's fun for me and I want people to think I have a good network. Now I have the responsibility, and I don't really care about them paying me more, because I make more money than I need to spend right now anyways. So I don't care about the extra money. Oh, well, now my weekends, which were already pretty screwed up with me not working. I spend time dinking around with MikroTik routers, or logging into my network to just see, oh, hey, how's that working from over the weekend? We did that on Tuesday. It was working pretty fine. I'm going to still check in on it. And, let's see if we can stress test it at 3 a.m. on Saturday night, because that's a fun thing to do. So, yeah, now we're going to have on call, and that's just going to be, it's like, man, I really don't want it, but we need it, and we don't have enough manpower for me to not do it. So, you guys are not setting my hopes very high. Speaking of which, what did you guys do for, Nick, what was your on call? How did you guys pay people?
So, first thing I'm going to say is, welcome to Thunderdome.
Oh, baby.
Second thing, I've been through the whole gamut of how we alerted people. So, usually it ended up, in many places it was me that actually built the monitoring system. So, in the old days, it started with what was called NetSaint at the time, and then became Nagios. And we used that with a pager tappy gateway. So carried around a pager like a drug dealer, and you would get, initially it was just a number, and then you get the ones that had the alphanumeric display, and you could actually dial into the tappy gateway and send it a string of text that would show up on your pager, right? So that's how we would notify on up down. And if it was something that it didn't catch, then whoever caught it would just page whoever was on call, right? Mostly it was automated.
Sorry, I must have misspoke. I paid people.
Oh, pay?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just part of the job. There was no extra money.
Yeah, some places do per incident. Some people do, the hourly. Sometimes it's time and a half. I know a lot of the big companies, it's like per incident based on your response time. It's like a $400 payout. Like it just depends on what motivates the people and how many people you have and how good your tooling is. So it depends on the business, depends on the finances.
Yeah, I've always been salary since my second job in IT, and it was just expected, right?
Yeah, it's always
other duties as
I
assigned.
think I've been in that same boat. I've been salaried since I got out of college, and it's always just been it's part of your job. That's why we pay you. So
See, I'm too smart to be salaried.
Well, it depends because, like, for my example, the company I'm working for right now, we just have Discord alerts that a tier 2 technician makes a ticket and calls the field dispatch team, and they just go like fix the thing. So it's not like I have to dig through logs. Like NetXMS tells Discord, like, you got a temperature threshold problem. We've got a high error time on an access point, so somebody's got to go do like a split, and it's just so it's your job to make it easy on yourself so that the company's taken care of, right?
yeah, but you still got to wake up in the middle of the night and actually fix whatever the problem
Yeah,
is.
when
True.
yeah, when the customer resets the like what we need to do, what we have for on call is people resets their router and then call us 5 times over the weekend screaming about their internet not working. And that is what's been getting to my GM and is what's starting to annoy my customers is that for my month of giving my workplace a, hey, if you guys don't change things, I'm out of here because I'm not having fun right now. I worked my 8 to 4:30 and then went home and didn't do on-call stuff. So that month there were a lot of people who were really, really angry because I wasn't doing stuff after hours. I wasn't doing stuff on the weekends like they had been getting at me. So I wasn't working more than 40 hours a week. And so, yeah, they realized like, oh, yeah, we need to change this bad. So it's going to be a very painful process, I think, for first while. But
it sounds like you have to deal with both the customers and the backbone.
Oh yeah, we have over 1,000 customers, and there's we are at our highest, and we have 6 employees.
Sounds like you might need a managed router service and software.
Yeah,
to make your diagnostics faster.
Yeah, let's see, who was that we were talking about a couple podcasts ago that had that full system? Oh, maybe I could hire a consultant who I could just have come in and do my job for me.
You should holler at that Nick
That would be
Arellano
wonderful.
guy. He's got some pretty cool stuff going.
Yeah,
I don't know what you're
that'd be
talking about.
great. No, dude,
It's not vaporware.
I tried to.
I don't get to
Yeah.
work on passion projects right now, unfortunately.
That's unfortunate.
Aww.
So
Yeah. He likes to do sculptures and mashed potatoes, so I guess we'll put that off.
yeah.
That's his medium of choice. All right, guys, we're at about 2 hours, so we got to get Nick Braulio out of here, so let's stick a fork in it. I will start the same way we started. So,
One quick thing.
yes.
One quick thing. I just added it. I saw a little bit ago. I just saw an email that said that Ubiquiti is renaming UNMS into UISP.
For Ubiquiti Internet Service Provider.
Yeah,
All right.
Did they add in the date that they'll stop supporting it? Because that's probably coming soon too.
No, that's unexpected. They're just gonna roll the dice on that one.
UISP,
Yeah.
the new version is supported only on their hardware device, so you've got to Get that, and they're going to sundown the old one too soon.
Or even better, their cloud.
Yeah,
no.
Terrifying.
No more local management on equipment. It's all in UISP.
I know in the announcement I saw it said that they had no other planned changes, just that they were changing the name.
Okay, rock and roll.
Well,
why even bother?
So whatever that means.
Announce that until the product's ready for release with using the new name. Oh.
Also, you know what this new app is on your phone.
Fair enough.
That suddenly popped up.
With a beard. All right, so now let's stick a fork in it. That way. It's Nick Arolano. Nick, if folks out on the big wide web want to get a hold of you, how do they do that?
They can go to the Brothers Wisp Slack group, or they can email me at nick.a@hey.com.
nick.a@hey.com?
Yep, HEY.
All right, that's way easier.
Nice and short.
than the way you used that. How folks do it. All right, excellent. Nick Braulio, the other Nick. No, dang it, you're that way. Nick Braulio, that way. If you want folks out on the internet to get a hold of you, how would you have them go about that?
I'm on the Brothers Wisp Slack as well. Lots of good folks on there, and a lot of great information and knowledge to share. I also have a Twitter account. It's at Forwarding Plane that I occasionally look at, and then the blog is just forwardingplane.net.
Such a cool name for your blog. Super jealous.
I also own managementplane.net.
You old school network guys. Got all the cool stuff. All right. Tommy Krogan, how would you have folks get a hold of you out on the internet?
I am at lostcreek.tech. Tommy C or actually I think I'm just Tommy at Lost Creek Tech is my email per your suggestion. Or you can find me on the Little Brothers Wisp Slack. I'm always there, usually parroting your or Nick Braulio's or Nick Arolano's information that they gave me years and years ago when I first joined up. And then I'm also on the Mimosa community page there. I check that very, very routinely. And I help people with Mimosa equipment and or other networking questions. So if you go anywhere there at those locations, I can be more than happy to help you out.
Rock and roll. Mikey, how would you have folks get a hold of you?
Leave me alone.
Customary response.
Good answer.
Mike will find you. He's like, it's like Taken, right? He's got a particular set of skills. When he needs your help, he'll find you, you'll help him, and then he'll leave. So, now, if you want to find me, I'm Greg at gregsoul.com. I regularly blog. Like, I am super regularly blogging now because I'm learning too much stuff to stay in my brain, so I have to be able to go back and reference it. So, gregsoul.com, you can do that. You can find me in Little Brothers Wisp Slack. Man, my weeks are very cyclical. I've been really busy, like a couple of weeks ago, so I didn't get in there very much. This next week, I'm going to be a little bit slower, so I'm going to get in there. I say that, even though I don't have customer engagements, I have this little thing inside my brain that says, you must produce things, and so I'm constantly doing stuff. Anyway, you can also find me, Little Brothers Wisp Slack, if you DM me, if you need something specific. Great information sharing, man. You guys have been killing it in there. You are amazeballs. I love it. I guess any questions, comments, keep them coming. Until next time, thank you, Nick Arolano. Thank you, Nick Braulio. And Nick Braulio, we could just sit here and talk for 2 hours just on that one subject, dude. So I feel like we shortchanged that. But hopefully we can catch up some more on that. Mikey, Tommy, thank you. Thank you guys for listening. See everybody next time.
See ya.
Telling you don't know what you are missing. Ideas and some good comedy given. If you missed the show already, don't worry, you're forgiven.